So glad to be back with everyone tonight and really looking forward to this chance to dive into the beating heart of Amoris Laetitia, which are chapters 4 and 5. But before we get into what we're going to be focused on tonight, I just wanted to bring you back to the conversation we were having last week and to see maybe what's been percolating in the last couple days as you think through how Pope Francis is trying to read the signs of the times and really be attentive and responsive to the experience of families today. So if you remember, last week we were talking about the ways in which families suffer from sinful social structures, the acknowledgement of family life being complex and challenging. And also, the Pope inserts his concerns about family structure. We see that, marriage is on the decline, divorce is way up. There are a lot of couples who serially get married and divorced, which causes a lot of instability, especially to children. And so the Pope makes, the point that as society, is in flux, it both impacts families and adds stress to families, but it is also a symptom of families in stress or families that are struggling. So as the saying goes, as families go, so goes society. So this is a chance for the Pope to really, I think, underscore the importance of the stability of love and fidelity within the family unit. And then in chapter 3, we look at Jesus and the way that he presents the vocation of the family. It's a reminder for the church, especially to clergy who will be reading the document, that we have been we've been called to form consciences, not replace them. And that when they're doing this conscience formation, that really what Pope Francis wants to be the predominant theme is mercy. Part of that revolution of tenderness that he's been emphasizing since Evangelii Gaudium in 2013. And as we talked about last time, I love this presentation of Jesus as at the heart of so many love stories. And he doesn't just mean biblically, he means today and throughout history, where people of faith have been able to not only grow in love, but grow in love of Jesus, or how keeping their faith at the center of their lives has been essential for them to continue to grow in love over the course of their lifetime and to help raise children in the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Pope also talks about how, the sacrament of marriage is both a gift and a task, that there's work involved, this lifelong conversion, and tips his hand to what he'll be talking about in subsequent chapters about the fruitfulness of love, especially through the gift of children. And I really love this line from paragraph 66. Every family, despite its weaknesses, can become a light in the darkness of the world. So a reminder to families that they are icons of the triune God and little mirrors of heaven, a foretaste of our destiny, of union with our triune God, of love that is offered, received, and returned. So at the end of our time together last week, I posed these 3 questions, and I welcome, your reflections or any insights or of your own questions that have been percolating since we were together last. So those 3 questions, just to remind you, first of all, what does the church still need to learn so that I can more effectively impart wisdom to families? And then secondly, the ecclesial documents get in the habit of denouncing sinful social structures, but seldom does it really point to concrete examples of what this looks like or how people can get involved at the grassroots. And I understand that's a challenge, because these ecclesial documents are speaking to 1 billion Catholics all over the world who have very different local contexts across the globe. And by virtue of the principle of subsidiarity, we have to take action at the lowest effective level. And there's no one size fits all solution. But I do wonder, how do we help nudge the church in the direction from denouncing sin to actually dismantling the sinful structures and to, you know, shouldering our responsibility to help people really try to break down the barriers to human dignity and right relationship. And then third, I posed this question in light of the several paragraphs dedicated to Pope Francis's reflection on how marriage is both natural and supernatural. And I'm interested in your thoughts. Why does it matter that marriage is both a civil institution or civil right even, and also a sacrament? There really isn't any other analog for this. Um, like speaking for the church, right? Like there's no secular analog for baptism or for holy orders or professing vows. But here we have marriage that is, this civil institution, and perhaps also we should emphasize it as a civil right. But it has this sacred dimension that not everyone recognizes, and yet that the Pope is insistent is essential to really understanding how God has used marriage to bring order to human cultures all over the world. So I'll leave it there just to hear what's coming to the surface for you, or questions that you might have had that we didn't have time for last time.
On the third question, I thought about that a little bit, the secular and the sacred. I mean, the things that you mentioned, baptism, the priest, and so on, you know, those are things that are proper to the ecclesia itself. I mean, the world doesn't really care if we have priests, and the world doesn't really care if we have baptism or confirmation. That's an intranos. Those are intranos sacraments. But
Mhm,
but I mean, from the time of you know when you go back and think about the Greeks and the philosophers, I mean, the family is the social unit in the world, whether it's sacralized or not sacralized. Society um, exists, and
mhm,
and there are problems now in society because people aren't too compelled by the idea of marriage. So there are problems, but I mean, it doesn't matter if it's sacralized. It matters in the church.
mhm.
It doesn't matter in the world if it's sacralized. In the world, it matters because this is the way I understand it from reading ancient philosophy. These are the building blocks of society, without which we don't have society.
Mhm.
So, it's very important. And I think, you know, I was after sometime in February, there was an op ed in the New York Times. Um, and the title of it was, I asked, what do you think about dating and marriage? And there was silence. I don't know if you saw this, but it was an interview with the writer, with somebody who tries to understand why young people uh, don't think that. I think in this particular article, Pew Research said that 71% of the young people who were polled, said jobs and a career, enjoying that is the source of fulfillment. Only 23%, I'll send this article to you, uh, Marcus, only 23% of the respondents said they thought marriage was a path to fulfillment. You know,
Wow, yeah, please send that to me.
Yeah, it's frightening, don't you think, when you hear that? But I mean, and that's what I mean. We're not even talking about the sacred now, just on the secular side.
Mhm.
Once people begin to abandon this notion that family is the building blocks of society and that you can live as like monos or into but not really committed, our society starting to break down. That's what I think. I don't know.
Yeah,
Anybody?
I mean, I think I've got two thoughts in response to what you're sharing. The first is, I wonder sometimes, I'm certainly well aware of the decline of marriage, and especially among millennials and Gen Z, who are a little bit suspicious or skeptical that marriage will bring fulfillment to them. I wonder how much of that is the kinds of marriages they were observing, whether it was their parents or their, the friends of their, or parents of their friends. That there was a survey that I saw not that long ago that asked husbands and wives to rate their happiness on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being, as happy as you could imagine yourself being, and, 0 or 1 being miserable. And husbands rated themselves very happy. I think they were, on average, in the United States, 7 out of 10 in terms of happiness. Wives, on the other hand, were 3 out of 10.
Wow.
And so I wonder, if you see a lot of unhappiness in marriage, or people who are lonely. And earlier on in our conversations, maybe in the first week, I talked about, how historically the 7-year itch was the make or break year for a lot of marriages. But now we're seeing that's not the case. More often now we're seeing a divorce happen around the time when a couple becomes empty nesters, because they were so heavily invested in parenting and trying to be attentive to their kids that they grew apart. And, the kids leave for college and the parents say, I don't even know my spouse anymore, much less, want the same things as my spouse. We don't know how to get along anymore because we've just been dividing and conquering to keep our heads above water. 40% of marriages experience infidelity. And I can imagine that's a really painful experience, not only for spouses, but for their children. And so I am curious about the way in which, yes, we've got a secular vision of marriage, as a civil right and a civil institution. But I hear from a lot of my students that, they're kind of ruined by the way that marriage is presented in secular culture, because it's all about getting swept off your feet and falling in love, almost helplessly and hopelessly, as if this is something that just happens, with pixie dust. I kind of tell my students, I don't know that we should use that phrase about falling in love, because it seems like it happens to us more than anything, and that it's just as easy to fall out of love, rather than thinking about love as something that is a mutually created dynamic. So I worry about maybe the unrealistic expectations that, we get from rom-coms, or people who just expect happiness to come from your spouse, rather than it to be something that you create together, in a shared commitment to a common good, not just, ego or whatever is comfortable or convenient, or but through the sacrificial agapic love that the church is presenting for us. So that's one thought. The other thought is also, I think it's really interesting that in the Reformation, Martin Luther, who's an Augustinian priest, and I don't know that he really wanted to to found a new religion. I think he was more interested in trying to bring much needed reform to the Catholic institution. But as it was becoming clear that reconciliation with the Catholic Church wasn't tenable, Martin Luther rejected the idea of marriage as a sacrament, as well as holy orders, because he really believed that sacraments should be for everyone, that we shouldn't have some sacraments that are only open for some members of the church. And I think there's something about that that's kind of intriguing, that although I appreciate the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage, and certainly as someone who's been married, 19 years, and certainly sees abundant grace in the way that my wife is trying to get me to heaven, and making me a much holier person than I was before we got married, I do worry about the way in which, this sacrament can set some people apart, or maybe create tiers of people who are, more or less, closer to God or farther away from God, or closer to holiness or farther away from holiness. And so I do think that, thinking of marriage as having this civil analog could maybe remind us that this doesn't have to be everyone's vocation, or the only way to happiness, or the only way to share in love.
Are you paying any attention to the news?
In really trying to emulate the triune love of God, where love is offered, received, and returned in mutuality.
Marcus,
Other thoughts in response to these questions, or what we talked about last week?
Sister Mary Alice Peel would like to, she asked me to call her so that she could speak through my phone to you.
Okay.
Can you hear her now?
Hi, Marcus. Can you?
I can hear you.
Good. Marcus, oh, this is wonderful. Um, here's something I'd like to bring to you. In teaching marriage over the years, I've always reflected on it in terms of the many modes of Christ's presence.
Mm.
And to look at marriage as two baptized individuals becoming a new mode of Christ's presence in the church, the head of a domestic church, and all that would mean. Would you reflect on that?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And rather than having me reflect on that, do you want to add a little bit more of how you've come to understand this and why that's an important part of how you teach marriage?
Yeah, because as a liturgist, within the marriage rite, they're coming in from the Anglican rite are the two candles that is.
Can't hear her.
No.
Sister Maria, I think we lost your sound.
I don't know where. Can you hear me, Marcus?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. You just can't see me, right? I'm Kim. I don't know what's happening because I know I don't know where she went. I don't even see. Let me see. It's showing that she's still on, but I don't know why her camera dropped.
I can see Maria, but I can't hear her.
You can see her, but you can't hear her.
Mm-hmm.
I just told her we can't hear, but I'm not responding.
Peggy, did
Does
you
it
want
look
to
like
in
she's
here?
talking?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, Peggy, you're muted. Let's see if we can get you unmuted.
Okay. You see, today, a lot of women spend many years trying to achieve a profession.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they do, they want to use it. And we all want them to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what happens in the process is that the vocation of marriage and motherhood seems demeaning. It seems like service. But I think we need to re-emphasize the beauty of what this love of what a woman or a mother contributes to a family.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we're overemphasizing the significance of achievement, professional, academic, whatever. And sometimes I read articles about women who justify being mothers and caring for their children, which is the beautiful vocation. I mean, we are following, we have to, I think that all of us, we can't just say with the church, whoever the church means us. We all have to get on board with the beauty of the sacrament of marriage and baptism and what it is to serve and what it is about family, what it is to belong.
Mm.
In my years of teaching, the students all want to belong. They'll do anything. They'll join all these sites, everything. You know what's going on in technology today with the subversiveness of dignity and so forth.
Mm.
But the thing is, family is, we have to, it's important to keep its the place in the world in the secular world and in the church. And we have to, it is important, and everyone's important in it. And whatever you do is important. We have to refocus on what is success.
Mm.
And the mothers, women justify sometimes having children. It's painful to even hear it, but it to be a mother, to be a woman, to be a father, or everything, to be part of a family, it's all wonderful. And sometimes we all have to exercise our abilities to refocus on the beauty of this sacrament.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. That's a really good lead in to what Pope Francis writes in chapters 4 and 5. So we will talk more about that shortly. And I do think that that there are a lot of mothers who love nothing more than being mothers. I think a lot of the problem comes from the lack of the equal distribution of labor in the home. There's a sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, who wrote a book called The Second Shift. And she was noticing that, when women started working more and more outside the home, they would get home from, the job, outside the home, and they would have to work a second shift at home. They'd have to get dinner ready. They'd have to do the laundry. They'd have to clean the dishes. They'd have to pack lunches for tomorrow for school. Like they would be up, till 9 or 10 at night doing all of this domestic labor, which of course is unpaid. And we know even now that although we have maybe some more enlightened husbands in this country who are sharing more domestic chores around the house, that even today there is a real imbalance between the work that women do as compared to the work that men do. And because so much of that domestic labor, almost all of it, is unpaid, it does heap on an extra burden on women. And so while I appreciate what you're saying about the dignity of motherhood and the absolute need to reaffirm the dignity of the human person and to create a culture of belonging, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think we have to do a lot of work to make things more equitable at home, because I think a lot of women are just plain exhausted and perhaps also rightfully resentful of their spouses who aren't pulling their fair share. And so this vision of marriage as rooted in equality and mutuality, while a beautiful ideal, isn't always actually how people experience marriage. And I imagine there are a lot of women who see their mothers just absolutely spent and who decide that's not what I want, because life isn't meant to be just working from sun up to sundown and to get little thanks for it. So I think this is the wisdom of having conversations like this. So I thank Sister Maria for having a 5-week session on the joy of love, because everyone is impacted by family life, right? Because those women who are exhausted, that they can't be great employees or friends or members of society if they're constantly being stretched thin, or if people are constantly putting more in their lap and they don't have time for self-care, or they don't have a partner who's willing to pull their fair share. So I think it's short-sighted for us to think that the joy of love is something that's only relevant for married couples or for people who are raising young children. This is absolutely essential to every member of the church and every member of society. So with that, let's move on to the heart of Amoris Laetitia. I don't want us to delay too much longer the topic for tonight, especially because this is the beating heart of the document. And in my humble opinion, if people only read chapter 4 and 5 of Amoris Laetitia, I think it would be enough. I really think the gift of this apostolic exhortation is what Pope Francis has to say in these 2 chapters. It really is a beautiful vision of love. And I think I find it really inspiring. Just in preparing for our conversation tonight, I was moved by what the Pope writes in these 2 chapters. And I think if there was a way to translate this, whether by clergy or deacons in their homilies, or in religious education, or in pastoral ministry, or in marriage preparation, like a pre-Cana event. I really think it would help people kind of set their sights higher so that we kind of expand what we imagine possible for ourselves and for each other. So chapter 4 is called Love and Marriage. It's Pope Francis's vision of a virtuous marriage, where he's reflecting on Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verses 4 through 8. If you've ever been to a Catholic wedding, you've heard this reading, right? Love is patient, love is kind, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's a little bit annoying, to be honest, not only because of all the times we've heard it at marriage, but Paul is not thinking of marital love here. He's not thinking of liturgy. No disrespect to any liturgists who are here. Paul is thinking about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, and he really does envision love as a virtue, in the way that Aristotle understood it. Right? It is an attitude and a disposition oriented toward the good, and Paul is really interested in how we help shape people through being loved, and not just thinking about love or talking about love. Right? Later on in this chapter, he says, if you do good works but you do not have love, it's useless. Right? So we can go through life, and we can, going back to what Sister Maria said about thinking happiness comes from achievement or a job or a salary. Right? Paul would say the only path to happiness or fulfillment is really a path that is rooted in love, where we, have everyday experiences of being loved and loving others. From Pope Francis's perspective, he really wants to frame this virtue of love through, no surprise here, mercy. Right? I mean, given the extraordinary jubilee of mercy, Pope Francis is most interested in how love softens our hearts, helps us to practice forbearance, even in the face of painful relationships or encounters. And he reminds us that, God never tires of forgiving us. It's we who get tired of asking for forgiveness. But I think it's also, I in that very first meeting that we had 2 weeks ago, I raised the concern that sometimes this emphasis on forgiveness can mean that we might get people to think that they have to just keep turning the other cheek, or, some people might think that a good Christian is someone who's always acquiescing to others, or who ultimately becomes a doormat. And I think it's worth highlighting here that although Pope Francis is really interested in the kind of love that does forgive others, and that is always open to forgiveness, that it does not mean tolerating disrespect. And he has some paragraphs later on where he is once again, I think, most of all popes in recent memory, the most specific and the most substantial in condemning domestic violence, or highlighting the ways in which love should never be coercive or domineering. So he outright rejects a reading of Ephesians 5, where wives should be subordinate to their husbands, which in a lot of Christian denominations, Ephesians 5 is a very problematic passage that does kind of uphold a patriarchal view of both family and church. And Pope Francis here rejects that outright. In fact, I was kind of shocked, I have to say. In paragraph 173, Pope Francis says that he is in favor of feminism. I don't think I have ever read a line from a pope where he actually says that he supports feminism. And he qualifies that. He says, so long as it's not opposed to motherhood. And I don't know any feminists who are opposed to motherhood, or who are, suspicious of motherhood, or tell people not to become mothers. But I do think, that this is a mark of some considerable progress, especially since, the Catholic Church did not teach that the sexes, men and women, were equal until the 1980s under the pontificate of John Paul II. So, here we've got I think even more progress in really making sure that love, especially in the home, is much more egalitarian than a hierarchical or patriarchal view of the domestic church, where you have laity as second-class citizens. I think in previous iterations of church documents on family life, you kind of had the parents who were, like a priest and a nun, and then the children were like the laity, who were kind of the ones who were dependent on the parents. And now we see this much more as something where there is a vision of love that is tender, that is mutual, that is equal, that is reciprocated, and that is imperfect. So in paragraph 113, Pope Francis writes, "Love does not have to be perfect for us to value it. The other person loves me as best they can with all their limits, but the fact that love is imperfect does not mean that it is untrue or unreal. It is real, albeit limited and earthly." And so I think this is a lifting up of the daily experience of families. In Spanish, this is called lo cotidiano, just the grace of everyday life. And I think this is really something very beautiful, that it's not just we draw near to God on Sunday, or when we're at Mass or receiving Eucharist, but that the imperfection of human love is still a way that we can be attentive and responsive to the presence and power of God, and the way that we are partners with God in building up the reign of God right where we are, warts and all. Later on in chapter 4, Pope Francis highlights that love endures all things. That's a direct quote from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He adds, it never gives up. And I think what's really interesting, in paragraph 118, he actually references Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, which has to be, at least as best as I know, the first time in history that a pope cites Reverend King. And he does so, talking about King's example that we should love even enemies, that love should not just be something that's tit for tat, or I scratch your back and you scratch mine, but that there is something, and this is really the point of agapic love, that it seeks nothing in return, and that it involves risk, that it is a love that is interested in breaking through cycles of vengeance, but also of thinking in terms of self-interest, or what benefits me, or what's comfortable or convenient for me. That this is a love that is genuinely agapic, in the sense that it seeks nothing in return. I also appreciate how Pope Francis highlights that marriage is really about friendship. From Aquinas, we learned that the experience of love, or caritas, is friendship with God. And so I think here Pope Francis gives us a number of really beautiful considerations of the way that the friendship of spouses is a way to model that friendship with God, of just that intimate relation, the union, right? Aquinas teaches the effect of love is union, that intimacy that is really about trust and fidelity, and not control. So again, Pope Francis is worried about ways in which love, even though we want to honor it in its everyday qualities and in its imperfections, that we don't normalize love that is manipulative or coercive, or that expects something in return. So he says that it should be really ordered toward appreciation, not a possession. I think a good reminder, especially in our consumer culture, where we can think of love in terms of what is pleasing for me, or even I saw online last week that people are changing their vows, so that instead of saying "till death do us part," they're now pledging at their civic marriages that they are going to love each other as long as this is mutually beneficial. And I think that really shows the way in which people are changing how they understand love, that this isn't till death do us part, or through sickness and in health, or in riches or poverty, but as long as this works for me, and when it stops working for me, then I want to be done with it, right? I want to be set free. That's not at all what Pope Francis understands love in marriage to entail or require. And one of the reasons why I really do wish more Catholics would spend time with this chapter of Amoris Laetitia, because I think it is really inspiring to imagine a love that really does not seek anything in return and is always interested in trying to will the good of other people in our lives. So continuing through chapter 4, Pope Francis is interested in love as a virtue, and virtues are dispositions and actions that are repeated over time. Aristotle said we are what we repeatedly do, that the character is the summation of our habits, and our habits are the result of our specific choices. And he was mostly right. Today, sociologists would add not just that we are what we repeatedly do, but that the deepest formation happens in relationship with other people. So it's more accurate to say we are what we repeatedly do together. And I think in the second part of chapter 4, Pope Francis is really trying to invite us to see the ways in which love shapes us and forms us and transforms us. And I love this line in particular from paragraph 128. Love opens our eyes and enables us to see beyond all else the great worth of a human person. And elsewhere, he commends contemplation to married couples, that they just take time to contemplate their spouse. And if you're familiar with Walter Burghardt, you know that his definition of contemplation is taking a long, loving look at the real, to really try to see the world through God's eyes. And I imagine that marriages would be qualitatively quite different if couples actually did practice that kind of contemplation, where they gazed at their spouse in a clear-eyed way, right? Not in a romantic way of, sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, of thinking they found their missing piece or the one, but to see the good in their spouse exactly as they are, not as we might want them to be or wish they weren't, but just to look at the real and to be filled with delight and joy for that person as an icon of the divine. And then to be open to that too, to be on the receiving end of that delight. Because I think when a lot of us look in the mirror, we might be tempted to squirm or to focus on the things that we're not really proud of or happy about within ourselves. We might be tempted to think that we aren't doing a great job of measuring up, or worry that we're a disappointment or a burden to other people. So I really appreciate that, here Pope Francis is not just talking about a theory of how to love well or be loved well. He's really interested in love as a spiritual practice that is really tuned into the goodness of every person, but in particular, this person who has made vows to love, honor, and serve me for a lifetime, through the daring promise to say that, I will love you no matter what. And there's that old joke about why people cry at weddings. And it's because that couple has no idea what they're in for, but all the other married couples in the church know what they're in for, or at least have some idea what they're in for, and it brings them to tears. But I do think that there's something really hopeful and inspiring about a couple who is willing to make that daring pledge to say that we are willing to have each other's back and to make this pledge of fidelity as a commitment through all the highs and lows that life will bring, because you are worthy of being loved, and not just when it's comfortable or convenient, or when it's easy, or when the good times roll. And I think too that there's some important paragraphs where Pope Francis really deftly talks about the goodness of sexual desire. That I think there are a lot of people who've grown up thinking about human sexuality as something that's shameful, or something that should be just reserved for the bedroom, and we just don't talk about it. And in fact, in my marriage and family class every spring, I ask my students how many of them got the birds and the bees talk from their parents. And only a handful out of a class of 30 will raise their hand. Most students don't get that talk, that frank conversation about the gift of human sexuality or the weight of the responsibility that comes from human intimacy. And we know statistically today, most people get their sexual education from pornography, which, I think it's also worth noting, and it's lamentable that, we're not just talking about, still images, but we're talking about really graphic videos. There's a sociologist named Gail Dines who's done research on pornography, and by her estimates, 88% of internet pornography shows multiple acts of violence toward women. That we've really normalized sexual violence. And if that's where people are learning about human sexuality, then it's really easy for us to understand why sexual violence is so prevalent. We know statistically 1 in 4 women will be subject to sexual violence over the course of her lifetime. And if the church doesn't talk about human sexuality as good, or as sexual desire as good, I think it makes a lot of people look elsewhere to learn about human sexuality, or it really heaps on a ton of shame or secrecy around human sexuality. And I think that's part of the reason for why clergy sexual abuse was not only so extensive in the Catholic Church, but continued to be covered up, because people didn't know how to have honest conversations about it. Secrecy and safety are incompatible. And so I really appreciate these paragraphs for lifting up human sexuality, for elevating it, not just as something that we would put on a pedestal, but just as something that isn't casual or dirty, or something that should be snickered about, but as ordered to the good of the human person. Pope Francis writes about human sexuality as ordered toward an ever more stable and intense union, where eros is honed again by the virtues, right? Patience and humility, and being constantly mindful of one's spouse. And again, I think these paragraphs are really worth spending time on, so that we don't normalize sex as something that just makes us uncomfortable, because we are all sexual beings, and it's not something that we can just take out or compartmentalize. It's something that we should, I think, really integrate into what it means to be a healthy and virtuous human being. And then I also wanted to highlight not only that, this is a love that's promised forever, or something that's practiced as a daily habit, but this is really where Pope Francis highlights the joy of love, which is where we get the title for this apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, which is Latin for the joy of love. And I really appreciate that Pope Francis is highlighting the joyful dimension of love. That we're not a bunch of sourpusses who get overwhelmed with just the weight of what families carry, or the deck that might be stacked against us if we look at the divorce rate, or just the rampant unhappiness in so many marriages, or the unrealistic expectations. That there is a joy that comes from being loved and loving others, and in being able to look back at what a commitment made possible, and what it means to love someone and be loved across hardship, and being able to be tested by whatever life brings, whether it's illness or injury, or losing a job, or miscarriage, or losing a parent or a child, right? We know there are so many tragedies, and I mean, my heart goes out to families that lose individuals to gun violence, or there are 1,000 homicides a day around the world. There's so much violence in our world, and all the people who have to deal with grief, that even through the hardship and the suffering and the injustice, that there is still an opportunity to delight in the joy of love, and the gift of being loved and loving others, including through those really dark times that life brings. I think too, it's worth highlighting the paragraphs on effective communication. I'm sure there are a lot of married couples that could probably benefit from working on their communication skills and listening more to understand than anything else. And so there's another practical dimension to this chapter. But I think especially what I love is just this vision of partnership, the accompaniment of walking through life together, a lot like in the spirit of the Emmaus story, where, it's easy to miss the identity of the person who's agreed to walk with you, or to take that person for granted, or to have, something distract us from seeing Christ in this companionship. And so I really think it's beautiful that we get this vision of accompaniment, of walking side by side, not having one person lead the other and expect them to follow, or not, pushing and pulling, or one spouse carrying the other, but really this vision of just being able to walk side by side, and share the journey over a lifetime. So the fourth chapter of Amoris Laetitia is focused on love in marriage. And then the fifth chapter, I think, is also very beautiful, but it expands the reach of love so that it's really focusing not just on children or, the family unit, but really, highlighting the social mission of the family. This is another really beautiful chapter, and it's not very long. So I hope you got a chance to look it over. But if you didn't, I hope you'll spend some time with it, because this is really, I think, just a wonderful synthesis of how the church understands that, families serve as instruments for divine love, and that it doesn't get contained or trapped within the family unit. It is really meant to flow outward and to touch the lives of all the people we encounter. So the very first line of chapter 5 is love always gives life. That this is really highlighting the generative dimension of love, and a generative dimension of love that knows no bounds. And it's not confined to the members of a specific family unit. And Peggy, you were talking a little while ago about how we need to help people get in touch with the gift of motherhood. And this is what I was thinking of when you were speaking in paragraph 174. So right after Pope Francis affirms feminism in kind of an unexpected way, then the very next paragraph, I think this is beautiful, and so very true. Pope Francis writes, "Mothers are the strongest antidote to the spread of self-centered individualism. It is they who testify to the beauty of life." And I think this is so true. And there's a paragraph about, fatherhood, and, it's nice. But I really do think, this is something that we need to highlight as an ecclesial community, and not saying that this is, what it means to be a woman. I always get a little uncomfortable on Mother's Day when, a priest will ask all the women who are mothers to stand up and to receive a blessing. Because while it might be very well intentioned, I think it can come across as very exclusionary, especially to women who desperately would like to be mothers, but for some reason can't, or for women who've had a very difficult relationship with their mother, or just, people for whom, motherhood is a tricky thing, and Mother's Day can be a tough day. Maybe they're grieving the loss of their mother. So I think, in some ways there's a tension here between elevating motherhood, which, as someone who has seen the self-giving love of motherhood firsthand, and in observing my wife, who is my absolute hero. I mean, there is nothing she would not do for my children, for our children. She is the most generous and loving person that I know, and I'm just in awe of her ability to sacrifice so much, whether it's sleep or her own comfort, through pregnancy and nursing children and being up late at night and just all the selflessness that she models day in and day out. I mean, I really do think that motherhood has to be recognized as a path to holiness, no question. But we also have to acknowledge, as this chapter does, that the fruitfulness of love is not restricted to motherhood or to biological procreation. So there are a number of really key paragraphs here that that expand the scope of the fruitful dimension of love. And there's some backstory to this chapter. You may recall there were a number of conservative clergy who wrote a letter to Pope Francis who really wanted to see Pope Francis double down on the definition of marriage as between a husband and a wife, and who really wanted to see chapter 5 as a defense of traditional marriage, quote unquote, which I think is a little bit confusing. If you look at scripture, there is no one definition of marriage. We have countless examples of marriage in scripture. There's a husband, his wife, and his countless concubines. It's a husband, his wife, and his brother's widow. That there's marriages between a husband and his wife and his enslaved women. There's not an archetype or a biblical archetype of marriage. And I shouldn't have to pontificate much on this because, Sister Maria is a biblical scholar. I know you know better than I do that marriage is presented in myriad ways in scripture. So we should be careful about that. But I do think that even in the face of, that appeal by conservative clergy to defend a, quote unquote, traditional view of marriage, that Pope Francis makes explicit that, as I have here in the second bullet point, love overflows. And so we shouldn't confine it to, a cookie cutter vision of marriage. And I think, paragraphs 181 to 183 are really vital for understanding what Pope Francis has to say here in chapter 5. And again, this is, I think, a perfect crystallization of the Church's teaching of the social mission of families. Pope Francis writes, families should not see themselves as a refuge from society, but instead go forth from their homes in a spirit of solidarity with others. He adds that this is the place where families are integrated into whole persons. And to be a whole person is not just to be turned inward on the self or on the family, but as he explains in paragraph 183, it is to be filled up with love so that people are empowered to bind the wounds of the outcast, to foster a culture of encounter, and to fight for injustice. So this is where we get nurtured so that we can be people who nurture others. And that fruitful dimension of love it isn't restricted to a biological relationship between parents and children. That everyone is part of a family, even if you're not married, even if you're not a parent, even if whatever, right? Like it doesn't matter. We are all members of families and a family of families. So I like this line too in paragraph 197, that we belong to each other. Going back to what Peggy said, this deep desire for belonging. Even those who have made a shipwreck of their lives, we belong to each other, right? So this, I think, is maybe a little bit of a foretaste of Pope Francis's vision to build a church that leaves no one out and no one behind. He's hoping that families can do the same. We are all called to foster an ever deeper and more intense communion, regardless of our station in life. So because we got cut short of time last time with my 3 questions, I thought this week I would pose just 2. And I really like these questions. So I'm really interested to hear what they bring to the surface for you. So first, in chapter 4, Pope Francis underscores vows to lifelong love and fidelity, that they not only reflect God's everlasting love and fidelity, but protect the individuals involved. I mean, he says in paragraph 132 that these vows, that till death do us part, mean that I never have to worry about being abandoned. But we know that most marriages don't last forever, and many others remain unhappily married. So I wonder, must marriage be for a lifetime for it to reflect the divine nature of love? There's that line in Ecclesiastes, everything for a season. And so I wonder, does it mean that, when people get married, and as I've shared before, my wife and I were 23 when we got married. We had absolutely zero idea of what we were in for. Does that really mean that people, when they make those vows, that they can really know what they're promising? And should we expect it to be forever? Because we don't know what life will bring their way. And it takes two to make a marriage work. So can we fault people when a marriage falls short? And does it make it any less reflective of the divine nature of love? So that's my first question. And then in my second question, drawing from chapter 5, Pope Francis highlights the social mission of the family. But by all reports, families are already pressed for time, exhausted and overwhelmed. So I wonder, how can the church ask more of families without seeming insensitive or simply expecting too much, right? How do we tell families that they have to be ordered to the common good when they all feel, well, that's maybe an overgeneralization, but many families feel like they're barely delivering on the good for each other as members of the family, right? Like they just feel like they're doing everything in their power to keep their heads above water. Or they probably still feel like they're not measuring up, in terms of like keeping up with the Joneses or whatever other artificial standards that we might impose on ourselves. So I'm curious, whichever question you want to start with, what do these really, I think, inspiring chapters get you to think more about, or to question, or how might they stretch our imagination of what more is possible given what God provides us through grace, without just, expecting more and more of people and making it feel completely unrealistic?
I think, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
I think on the first question, should they last for a lifetime? I think that you should go into marriage expecting that it will last a lifetime. I think that if you start to go into marriage expecting that it's not going to last for a lifetime, or that it's okay if it doesn't last for a lifetime, it gives you an open door to run away too easily. And I think that, coming from someone whose marriage ended, unfortunately, I think that there's not enough that happens during the marriage, after the marriage happens, for people to get the support that maybe the marriage needs. And because of the family stresses that are there, because of the, you get married very young. You said you're married at 23. I was married at 26. Like, you don't know what life really means or is going to bring to you at that time. But as a married couple, I think that it's important to work through everything and grow together. And I think, the church very easily gives us all the information and tries to investigate everything before we got married, and, go through pre-Cana, and you go through baptism on how to, raise your children in the Catholic Church, but there's very little that's, ongoing for the marriage. I mean, there needs to be more support in how do you hold on to that love? How do you continue to grow that love and nurture that love, and, grow together? I think when you marry young, you do grow in different ways. And I think it's important to understand how to grow together. And I think that the church could provide some guidance on that, based especially on this document. I think it could be used for married couples in the church, to help those couples that might not last in their marriage. I don't think that you should go into it thinking that your marriage is going to end. I think you should go into it knowing that it's going to be hard, and that you'll do everything you can to make it sustainable and stay in that love that you have when you first get married.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I do worry. I mean, there's a movement, I think, especially among millennials and Gen Z, that instead of making vows for a lifetime, you make it more of a contractual model of, we're going to make a commitment for 5 years or for 10 years or whatever, and then we'll revisit this. And I think that makes marriage much more transactional than transformative. and something that we instrumentalize the institution so that it benefits us or maybe benefits the children or whatever. I mean, I think there's something broken about marriage. I don't know that it's the church's view of marriage that's broken, but the average wedding costs about $30,000 in this country. The average divorce costs even more. I mean, attorneys certainly get their money's worth out of representing spouses who are divorcing. And let's see, getting some feedback there. So I think, there's this line among especially some disgruntled men or resentful men. They say it's cheaper to keep her than to divorce her, which, I think is terrible.
Adulting.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think that's, the role of the church is to try to lead people towards wisdom, right? And towards human dignity and freedom, which is not freedom from encroachment or freedom from, interference. It's freedom for self-gift. And so I do wish that that more churches were helping couples find encouragement and inspiration in documents like Amoris Laetitia. I know, at the time, then Bishop McElroy was really doing a lot of work out in San Diego after Amoris Laetitia came out to try to get this into parishes. And I think that's a good example for other parishes or dioceses to follow. But I also think it's really hard, because people are so busy and they do feel stretched thin. It's hard to ask, couples or families to make time for something like this when they feel like, they're already dealing with a scarcity of time. And obviously, to your point, if people invest in their marriage and if they're intentional about growing together, it pays its own dividend. But I think it's really helping people with that, and making sure that there's childcare or some kind of support system there to try to make things easier for families rather than something else to guilt trip couples or families to say, why aren't you attending this session or reading Amoris Laetitia or whatever the case may be.
And you talked about the empty nesters phase too, where you spend 21 years or more, depending on how many children you have, raising your children, and the constantness of that, and the schedules, and the cleaning, and the groceries, and the laundry, and everything that goes with it. And it's very easy to lose connection with your spouse during that time. But then when the children are now gone, how do you reconnect? I think that's come into play very well at that point. Like, how do you reconnect? How do you find that love that maybe was there but needs to be nourished and nurtured again? I think that's where the church could put out some of these things, because then you have all the time in the world.
Yeah, and I think if schools were a part of this too, whether it's Catholic middle schools or high schools, parents are always looking for resources to become good parents, especially with the temptations or the stresses that kids today have along the lines of social media and digital technology. And so on the one hand, you could help support parents by saying, here's some good parenting tips for how to talk to your kids, maybe about human sexuality or drugs or social media. But at the same time, then say, and here's how to talk to your spouse, right? And to remind couples to keep dating each other or learning about each other or, prioritizing each other. And so, because I think sometimes schools make it all about, preparing your kid for college or, getting ready for what's next. And it would be good too if schools also said, and the present and this moment is really sacred and special. And it's not always about just getting ready for the next thing.
Right.
Can you hear me now, Marcus? Because
Yep.
I had to switch to my phone. Sorry, but I used to have this discussions about the first question when I was teaching at the University of San Diego with a lot of people, and must marriage be for a lifetime? I think that idea. When the average age of a human being was 35 years old to 38 years old, because now I'm looking at the other aspects here, biological, sociological. It was easy to imagine because by 35 or 40, what we know from psychology and human growth and development, you pretty fixed. But then you begin to move into phases of your life where you arrive at self-discovery and self-understanding that you didn't have at 23, right? And I guess, I've always wondered, for some people, they feel trapped and trying to continue to be the person that they were at 23 when at 55, they're not that person at all. I mean, um, just take something banal like, at 23, you're a guy, you sit on your couch and you watch TV and you drink beer. And that's great because the woman that you marry doesn't mind having you sit on the couch and watch TV and drink beer while she's doing domestic chores and kind of things. But, but she gets to be 50 and she understands she wants to see the world, do things that are cultural and uplifting, experience other places and people. And you still want to sit on the couch and watch TV and drink beer. And you can say, well, you knew what I was when you married me, and I wasn't really gonna, be anything more than that. And I don't know how the church, honestly, Kim says they don't help you when you get to that stage where he's on the couch and I want to do X or vice versa. She just wants to cook and I want to go somewhere. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not. When I listen to everything that you said tonight, I think, first of all, who reads this stuff? Who understands it? Who even gets it in the pew? How many priests even read the pontifical encyclicals and can chew this up and spit it out and help people? So I think these encyclicals are interesting. I'm not sure they're as useful as they should be, but I think some of the church's teaching is bound up with an idea of a human being that I would call static, and not dynamic, because people are dynamic and they change many times over in life. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure that what the church says about marriage is always in conversation with psychology and the social sciences. That's all.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Maria. And I think you're right. I mean, I think the church has to keep being in conversation with psychologists and social scientists to understand what is feasible so that we're not imposing too much on persons. I mean, you make a good point about life expectancy now being the longest it's ever been, and it would be very different for people to commit till death do us part, a couple hundred years ago when most people weren't expected to live much past 45. The same thing could be said for human sexuality, right? Like if most people were hitting puberty in the teenage years and they were betrothed within a year or two of that, telling people that they have to save sex for marriage isn't as much of an ask as it is today when, now we have girls who are hitting puberty at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and the average woman doesn't get married until she's almost 30. That's a long time to say that, you should not be sexually active. Totally different than a different age in history. But I do have to say that I think as an ethicist, there is I'm with you on the person being dynamic, and I do think Pope Francis acknowledges that more than John Paul II or did in Familiaris Consortio. But I also think it goes back to what Kim was saying about, growing together. People can grow and change, but if they do it together, if they're intentional about staying connected, about communicating those desires, about being honest with their feelings, that's really different than just saying, I don't want you anymore. I don't want this anymore. Right. The very first time I taught a class on marriage and family, I was still living in Boston, and I was teaching, the church's vision of marriage as an indissoluble union. And I had a student break down in tears. And I thought, oh my gosh, what have I said that is so insensitive that I've insulted this student. And so after class, I asked if she was okay and what I had said that had hurt her. And she explained to me that her father had recently fallen completely blind, that like he got an injury, or he lost his vision kind of all of a sudden. And not only was this just I think like a huge shock to the family unit, but on top of that, once she had learned that her father was going to be blind for the rest of his life, soon afterward, her mother had decided to file for divorce. And her mother just simply said, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to have a disabled spouse. I want to travel. I want to see the world. I want to continue to live life as an adventure. I don't want to be his caretaker for the rest of his days. And that was so deeply hurtful to her. I mean, she really felt genuinely abandoned by her mother. And I think her heart was breaking for her father too, that, like he didn't ask for blindness and he certainly didn't ask for the divorce. And it kind of felt like, getting kicked when you're down. And I think, that's a tricky thing here, because on the one hand, you do make these vows. On another hand, those vows shouldn't become a prison. And I'm not saying, that this woman did the right thing filing for divorce because her husband fell blind. But I do think that we've got to make room for people to figure out when the promises they made are no longer promises they can really continue to live out in good conscience, because life has changed just so drastically from what they could have anticipated. And maybe it's not blindness or illness. I mean, it could be mental illness or substance abuse or addiction. I had a student when I was teaching at Boston College whose father had such a profound gambling problem that he just took the family into bankruptcy, and this student wasn't able to continue her studies at BC. And this student was fiercely loyal to her dad. I mean, she never faulted him once for it, which I just thought was astounding. But there are people who, they can make some really bad decisions or wrestle with some demons. Just this morning, my wife and I got news that one of our family friends was arrested for having child pornography on his computer. And he's 81 years old. He's been married for decades and decades. In fact, I think he and his wife just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary not that long ago. And understandably, his wife is just in shock. She was preparing to retire as a nurse next month. And now, her whole future is just in total chaos. And so there is not only a dynamism to the human person, but a messiness to life. And I don't know that the church always honors that messiness by just saying, this is what marriage is, and it has to be like this, or we won't recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
Other responses to these questions, or anything else that you read or have been thinking about?
Peggy, did you want to say something?
I do. I do. I'm getting my thing.
It's on.
Oh, it's up. Okay, good. I want to say that I think that we come as persons to the church. The church is our mother, yes, but we come as persons, and we must use it. I mean, it would be helpful if we used the sciences, sociology, psychology, and so forth, and know that we are not saints ourselves. We're sinners. We come with sin. And the church offers us many things, but we have to avail ourselves. See, the church is available. Sometimes when it happens, we blame it on the church. And I think we have to widen our vision, because this experience of abandonment does come with the marriage, because we hold up the ideal of marriage and family, which is beautiful. And I think we have to uphold it. It's beautiful. It fortifies us. But I think we have to also know that there's also other sciences and gifts which impact our lives, and sin. And we are creatures. We are the imago Dei, and also we are sinners. And we bring that with us, and we have to always be on guard that, as you said, with the man, the 81, with the thing, in other words, everyone's destroyed. So in other words, we have to be cautious and try to be faithful, each one.
Yeah, you're right. We are all loved sinners, and all called to holiness. And I think, in the same way that the vision of marriage is so that the spouses get each other to heaven through that aspiration of growing in holiness, hopefully too, that families can bring each other and society closer to heaven. I think that's part of the point of the social mission of the church. The church's teaching of the social mission of the family, that sin is everywhere we look, but we're not going to settle for what a sinful world offers us and leave things stuck the way they are, because we're going to try to more fully rely on grace and where grace can take us in trying to build a new creation. So I think we're at time, and I want to be respectful of time. So for next time, this is where the document starts moving toward pastoral application. And so in chapters 6 and 7, this is where we begin to see Pope Francis's vision for how the church can better serve families. So if you have time to peruse chapters 6 and 7, I'll look forward to seeing what they add for you to ponder or question or imagine possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, and to everybody who had trouble logging on or whatever, I'm just going to try to find out why other links you get work and the ones coming out of Spirit Alive are not working. It's an issue. But I thank everybody for coming. And again, we're in a world of great discord and violence and lack of peace. So tonight, let us pray for peace, not only for Jerusalem, but peace for all the people in the world who are suffering right now from violence. May God be with them, console them. May God illumine the minds of the leaders of these nations to stop warring and move towards reconciliation, so that everyone has the peace and well-being that God has willed for every single person in creation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Good night, everybody. See you next week.